two of you. So that's good. Got everybody in there. Now, where we last left off, we were talking about something called a minimum wage. Now, a lot of countries have them, and these days when you read about it, they don't necessarily always say the minimum wage. They might say a national minimum wage, okay? Because it's the minimum wage of the country, so therefore national minimum wage. Some economists will abbreviate it to NMW, right? And it is something that's quite specific and purposefully set up by governments in different countries. They're going to have minimum wages at different levels, different countries, different rates, okay? So in America, they're debating whether $15 per hour is a reasonable minimum wage. Right, the slide that we've got up now says what would happen if we were to increase the minimum wage. So if you like, what I've done is I've taken out it's a bullet point from the syllabus, but it's almost like an exam question where they give you a case study. Say America is about to increase its minimum wage from $10 per hour to $15 per hour. It's a little bit less than $10 per hour. $15 per hour, what will the overall effect be in the economy? That sort of idea. Or explain whether that's a good idea or not. And so these outlines here step you through whether it will be good or not good. So advantages and disadvantages. So the top line here, the ones that are in green, those are all the advantages to the increase in the minimum wage. And it's ones that we would normally think about. We would suggest that there would be increase in wages, increase in income. So you've got more disposable income, so you're able to buy more goods and services, right? You're able to buy more goods and services. That increases demand for all goods and services in the country. Aggregate demand rises, more employment for the people who produce those goods, and so on. Perhaps even more tax revenue for the government because more people have jobs and incomes. But you can track the negatives, and we're going to think about the negatives in the term of red in the context of the diagram here, but also disadvantages. So any disadvantages seen to increasing a minimum wage. And it might actually lead to more automation. Okay, and this is something that has been argued, and particularly if you look at the United States of America, that has actually happened. As the minimum wage has risen, the cost of labor has risen, so businesses have substituted labor for machines, and they've got more robots doing the work. As we move through here, you'll see that because the wage cost rises, it costs more for businesses to operate. Right? They might increase the prices of the goods and services, and there's then potentially reduced consumer demand, a kind of a double effect in a way, because there's reduced consumer demand because of the higher prices, but also because there's fewer jobs, because there's more automation, okay? And as a result of that, people have less disposable income in order to buy the goods and services. So kind of a double effect there. So the point being is that depending on how you weight these ideas, you can either say raising the minimum wage is good, or you could say it's not good, right? So you've got arguments and counter arguments, depending which way you go. Okay, you might want to say, no, raising the minimum wage is a bad idea. Here's your arguments why, but you do have some counter arguments here. Or you might be arguing raising the minimum wage is a good thing. Here are your arguments. Here are your counter arguments. You will need to come to some sort of overall conclusion, right? And I would anticipate if you were writing all of this up, you'd end up with probably around about an A4, one side of an A4 page worth of writing, okay, to show the examiner that you have understood, you've fully explained this. Hi, Lancelot, good to see you. All right. And that this is an overall conclusion that you have come up with. All right. That you might say, because the disadvantages outweigh the advantages, therefore this isn't a good idea. Or you might say that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, therefore it is a good idea. But that will be up to you as to your writing and what you personally think. right? Now, it could be, again, that there is a case study involved. So you'd have to include within that information from the case study. There may be actual data, in which case you'd have to include the numbers that are used, right? Well, we see that when they increase the minimum wage in Sweden, this is what happened. I don't know why I chose Sweden. The unemployment level rose from this number, 300,000 to 350,000. I'm just making numbers up, you know? But along that sort of line, okay? Now, here's some quick fire questions for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you these questions. 1, 3. All right, and we're going to start off with the first one. The first one says, why might there be a shortage of nurses in a country? All right, so thinking again about the labour market, right? Now, what I'm going to get you to do is in the chat section, right, of the meet, right, you are going to come up with an answer to why you think there are fewer nurses potentially in one particular country. What is it that has caused that to happen? If you like, you can think about countries like the UK, where there are shortages of nurses, New Zealand, where there are shortages of nurses, and 1 or 2 other countries. So what do you think has caused that to happen? So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, to have a think as to what you think the answer might be. And I'd like you to put the answer into the chat today. All right, ready? Go. So you're answering why you think there might be a shortage of nurses in a country. Not sure if that makes any difference at all. I've got a new light thing. Doesn't seem to make any difference. Why might there be a shortage of nurses in a particular country? Again, if it helps, come up with an example. England, New Zealand. Why might those specific countries have a shortage of nurses? Yeah. Education system might be poor, which does not help people with an ambition to be a nurse to succeed. That's a good idea. That's a very good idea. Other thoughts? I'll give you a clue. There's a lot of different possible reasons. So there's not going to be one specific reason. There will be a number. Okay, good. So still thinking about that idea of why there might be a shortage of nurses in a particular country. Maybe we could think about the idea of elasticity that we talked about before with regards to supply of nurses. That could be one thing. We could think about the wages that might be able to be earned. That could be another. Yes, there is a link between these two, by the way.
So, Mr. David, you said it could be because the wages are too low. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So what does that mean then?
So, like, the nurses are underpaid?
So if the nurses are underpaid, therefore, what might they choose to do?
A different job?
A different job? Yes, that's exactly right. So therefore, you might end up with a shortage of nurses, or they might choose to move to another country where the wages might be higher or might be more affordable based on the cost of living. So point number 2 here about the nurses in the Philippines as to why they might relocate to London, okay, because that's what has happened. Okay. They may not be able to earn a lot in the Philippines, but they might be able to earn a lot more in London. So therefore they might choose to move, occupational mobility, remember that one, move to London, or geographic mobility, move to London, earn more income in London, and then be able to send perhaps some of the income back home to the Philippines. Think about the workers that you know of that have done just that have moved countries in order to earn a higher income potentially and send some of that income back home. But it is a real issue if you consider whether people want to take certain jobs. Okay, so at the moment in New Zealand, there is a shortage of fruit pickers, people who pick the fruit, quite literally. Main reason why is because New Zealand shut its borders, and so migrant workers aren't coming in. And they would have been the people traditionally who would have been picking the fruit. Now, why is it that New Zealanders aren't out there picking fruit? Why do you think? You can add into the chat, or you can voice an opinion if you think. Why would New Zealanders not necessarily be keen on picking fruit in New Zealand? Right, so it's going to be a similar reason about the nurses. Why does New Zealand have a shortage of nurses? You know, they're not paid a lot. I don't know if you are aware about wages in general, but to pick fruit in New Zealand is going to be quite low with regards to the wages you could possibly earn. And New Zealanders in general don't want that job because they're not going to earn the money that they want to earn. Right? A difficult job, a very physical job, and one that doesn't probably earn a lot of wages. You might think of other occupations and careers and think, would I choose to do that job or not? What are the wages of it? That's the decision making that we've been talking about. And then part of that is maybe I wouldn't, so therefore I might choose to relocate myself. Or what if they desperately need people doing that job? If there is a shortage of those jobs, or people doing those jobs, maybe the government has to intervene. Maybe the government can subsidize the wages, do you think? Maybe. Right. One of the things the New Zealand government did, because we had a very big shortage of nurses several years back, the New Zealand government actually flew people to the UK and encouraged UK nurses to fly back to New Zealand, paid for their flights and accommodation, etc., in order to get them to work in New Zealand, right? Because we needed them. So governments can do that. They can actually target specific occupations and say, we need workers in this occupation. We're going to find those people. Typically, it's the professionals, right? The ones who have that slightly higher level of skill, right? Slightly more inelastic than maybe some other skill sets. Right? I mean, you might make an argument even about the more inelastic demand of, say, doctors. You can still have a shortage of doctors because they are inelastic, so therefore, or more inelastic, so therefore if there aren't enough of them because of the demand for them, then where do you get them from? Well, you, I don't know, grow your own doctors, or perhaps get the government involved to try and find doctors from other countries and bring them in. Obviously, at the moment, there's probably a whole lot less of that happening. Very good questions to think about. And they are definitely policies that governments do consider, particularly if there are shortages in particular occupations, if they need workers in particular jobs. Right? Now, the government, therefore, can step in and interfere in the labour market. And one of the big ways was that idea about the minimum wage, right? That's a huge interference in the natural working of the market. But there are others, okay? What about employment rights laws? So laws about employment, yeah? Okay? Protecting the workers from discrimination, or just protecting the workers, right? The government could put those laws in place. It could say, your employer is not allowed to ask you to do this in your job because it's dangerous. Right? It is now illegal for you to do this, therefore somebody else has to do that because it is too dangerous for you in that job. Yeah. Classic example is the use of ladders. You've got to think to yourself, ladders, that's fairly common sense sort of approach, but there are laws in different countries about who can use a ladder and who can't. And in the UK, in a number of occupations, you actually have to have a certificate, a training about how to use ladders. Right? Otherwise, you could fall and hurt yourself, and that might be a problem. In America, it's a bigger problem because in America, if you get hurt on the work site, there's a possibility you might sue your employer. So there are a lot of government rules about protecting workers. And as said, preventing discrimination. There are government laws that say you're not allowed to discriminate amongst your employment practices, perhaps, but also just within the community in and of itself. Yeah? So protecting employers, they could put a law in to help the employers, give them more of an ability to hire who they want and fire who they want. They could do that as well. Maybe it's too difficult to fire people. Now, I know that sounds a weird thing. You kind of think to yourself, surely an employer can fire anybody they like. Not necessarily. There are, in many parts of the world, some occupations where it is actually quite difficult for the employer to fire somebody. Yeah? And it does sound quite an unusual thing, but there's something called tenure, which is a really old-fashioned word. And the implication of it goes all the way back, or the meaning of it goes all the way back to the very old days where people basically had a job for life. That once you got the job, it was yours for life. So you earned tenure, okay? Now, quite often you see lawyers earning tenureships, okay? Which means for them, unless they choose to leave or unless they do something that is completely against the law, they're likely to stay working as a lawyer for that particular firm. But there are other tenure examples, universities, all right? Sometimes the university lecturers will have tenure, right? Other times you might see in America, some of the states in America, some of their school systems, that their teachers, their high school teachers actually have tenure as well. And what that means is it's actually very difficult, again, for those teachers to lose their job, or the university lecturers, or the lawyers. It's actually quite difficult. It's an involved process. You know? There was an article that came out, I can't remember how long ago, it was a number of years ago. It was a good 10 to 15 years ago. That's how long ago it was. And it talked about the idea of tenure in the American high school system and how it should be gotten rid of, that the governments of those states should get rid of it. Because you ended up with the schools running out of their budget for staffing because they were paying teachers who they had effectively fired but weren't allowed to fire because they had tenure. And so those teachers were actually still coming to school, sitting in the staff room, reading a book. They weren't allowed to teach, okay, but the school couldn't get rid of them. Yeah? So those sorts of things are tied up with that idea of whether the firm, the business, has the ability to fire its workers and what rules and regulations are there in place with regards to hiring or firing of workers, and the government could get rid of some of those rules. Next one is this one here, which we're going to be doing some more work on. It's called a trade union. The terminologies we're going to touch base on soon, okay? But there are trade unions, there are unions involved with regards to employment quite often. And the government can put laws in place that say how powerful, how effective those trade unions can be. Now, we're going to learn about trade unions and what they do and how they do it. But to summarize, okay, to put it in a smaller point, they're there to protect the employees. They're an organized group of employees whose job it is to look after and protect the other thank you. All right, to protect the other employees. So when there are issues with regards to employment rights, the unions can potentially get involved. All right? I've had many dealings with different types of unions over the years, and there are some quite unusual things that can happen with unions. They can grow and become immensely powerful, right? Unions can. And when you look at it, you can see that in America, used as a case study, unions can actually be a lobby, right? Which means they can ask the politicians to pass more laws that are in favor of the workers and the unions, okay? And they can be very powerful with that. In fact, some unions have actually effectively become a political party. So if you look at countries like the United Kingdom or New Zealand, we have what's called a Labour Party. Now, traditionally, the Labour Party was formed out of the idea of the workers' rights and the trade unions. And in some cases, they're still calling them the Trade Labour Union Party. It's that connection that is quite a strong connection with the unions. So the government could interfere, and the government could make unions more powerful, or it could make unions less powerful. And that's another discussion that can be had in America at the moment, because the current president of the United States, when he was vice president, one of the conversations that he had with the president at the time, Barack Obama, was about the power of trade unions and whether it was worth decreasing that power, that their ability to interfere with business, or whether it was better to allow them to grow in power. I'm reading the autobiography of Barack Obama at the moment. It's really fascinating. Right. So those are some things that the governments can do. Which brings us to the next point, which is about trade unions. So we need to figure out what trade unions are, what is it that they actually do, and what implication, what does that have? What impact does that have? And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Should we be allowing trade unions to increase in power? Should we be putting laws in place from the government to decrease trade unions? You might have seen unions. See, look, I've got here, this is a protest here, right, in the slides, and it's about unions, okay? This one here is another protest here, about unionization here as well. And they're all discussing workers' rights, how much workers are being paid, so minimum wages, employment laws, all of those sorts of ideas. And that's what the unions are to do. So let's have a look. Dum dum. Terminology first. Trade unions. They are the organisation of workers. They get together, they band together to achieve a common goal like higher pay, increasing the number of employees, or better working conditions. Now, this is, again, looking back at history, right? A long, long time ago, when employers would require you to work really long hours, you wouldn't have a meal break, you'd have to, right? All of these rules and regulations, workplaces would be unsafe, people would get hurt, injured, or even killed at their workplaces, particularly in the factories. And there didn't seem to be any accountability for it. Now that came at a real big, there was like I was going to say an explosion, but that's not the right terminology. There was a very big historical event that happened in America at one of these factories. And what ended up happening was the workers decided to strike. The workers decided that they weren't going to work anymore because the employers were really treating them badly. And they were treating them very badly. Some people were dying and getting injured and stuff on the factory. So that's what they did. And the workers actually barricaded themselves in the factory, preventing the employer from getting in there to put more workers in to do the jobs that they wanted done. Yeah? So the employer, and this is historical fact, the employer then brought in basically a small armed group, right? It was basically soldiers with guns, and they shot them. They shot the employees and charged in and took over the place again. Now, the news footage of that, the actual news reporting of that was so shocking. This was in America. It was so shocking that it led to the creation of employment laws, it led to the creation of trade unions, and much more about protecting the rights of workers, much more thought about protecting the rights of workers. So even if you get a job, you're happy with the job, there are still going to be employment laws trying to protect you. But if you are an employer, some of those laws you might go, right? One of the most famous employment laws that got passed many years ago was the so-called 40-hour-week law, which basically said that 40 hours was what we were expecting employees to work, and that it was only at the goodwill of the employees to work longer than the 40 hours. Or in accordance, obviously, with their contracts that they'd signed. Now, that's what they are to do. They are to organise, to get together, to help pay, right? You want more pay for your job? Get the union to help negotiate it. You want better working conditions. We want air conditioning. We want ventilation. We want paid lunch breaks. We want somewhere to sit to eat our lunch, yeah? All of those sorts of working conditions can be tied up with what the union has to then negotiate with the employer. Now, obviously, the union then has to have some form of weapon at its disposal, so to speak, some form of way that the business then deals with the union, okay? And a lot of that has to do with this word called striking, and that's not that kind of striking, that's a different kind of striking. This is a refusing to work, right? So some people will just say, nope, not doing it, right? I've got a 7.5-year-old, he's quite accustomed to him saying, nope, not going to do that. Put my foot down, nope, not doing it, right? And effectively that's striking, yeah, in this particular context. If you're paid to do a job and you just refuse to do the job, right, that's striking, yeah? Now, there are whole different ways that the union can do these sorts of things, but they're two major tools. They have two major weapons, so to speak, that they use to get the things that they want to get. The first one is called collective bargaining. Now, the idea being collective, group, right, collective, the idea is because there's a large number of them that they have more power, right? If it's just you negotiating with your employer, your boss, and there's only one of you, the boss can just say, nah, go away, yeah? But if there's 100 of you all negotiating with the boss and he's looking around going, oh dear, there's 100 of you, if they all say that, they might all strike, and what am I going to do? Yeah, if there's 1,000, it's more. If there are 10,000, and so on. Now, this idea of collective bargaining is very big, and it's really important. Okay, it's the way that a lot of these changes actually happen. It's the way that you end up with higher wages for the different workers, and again, better conditions for when they're working. So a lot of that comes about as a result of this idea of collective bargaining. And the more people in the unions, the more power they have in order to do the collective bargaining. So what you saw in America, and you've seen it in New Zealand, and you've seen it also in the UK, is that smaller unions have actually merged with other unions to make themselves bigger so they have more power. So in New Zealand, one of the unions I dealt with was the Grocery Distribution Workers Union, which covered all of the supermarkets, but also all of the people who were in the trucking or the distribution of the goods and services, all of those people. And then they merged with the Retail Workers Union, so then it became the Grocery Retail Distribution Workers Union. So that was every single worker in any retail shop in the entire country, basically in that union as well. So it was a very big, very powerful union. Their second weapon is that strike idea. They've got more weapons, but these are the two that you most commonly hear about, right? Collective bargaining and strike action, right? And as said, a strike is when they stop working. They just say, oh, right? So you can imagine the people digging the road, right? Building the road. And then they decide to go on strike. So they just put their tools down and say, no, we're not doing anything. That's it. Until you meet our demands, right? Effectively holding the job hostage, so to speak. We're not going to complete this bridge, therefore nobody can drive over the bridge, therefore, yeah. So that's what the strike sort of idea is. And there are lots of examples of strikes, and there are some that are going to appear in the slides that you can look up, right? And it should be, in my opinion, now you might think differently, but in my opinion, strike action should be the last resort. It's like the nuclear button, okay? Effectively, you have said you can't negotiate at all with the employer, so you're going to hold the workplace to hostage, basically, right, in order to get what you want, yeah? Now, under the idea of collective bargaining, you're able to negotiate, you're able to trade. You know, we will take this, but we'll give up that, sort of an idea. So what unions tend to do here with collective bargaining is that they tend to ask for more than they actually want. We want a $15 per hour pay rise, when they actually would be happy with 10. That way, the employer gets to say, oh, $15 per hour extra, don't know we can afford that, what about 12? And the union says, done. And then they have gained, and they're able to go back to their workers, you've got a $12 pay rise, ooh, yeah. And the employer says, we managed to knock them down from that $15 pay rise that they're after, ooh, okay. So then both sides feel that they have gained. So that's what the collective bargaining idea is all about. But as said, unions do have more weapons at their disposal, and these are some, right? All right. Sorry, my poster's just fallen off the wall. So negotiation, so that's the collective bargaining idea. The next one is called a go slow, and that's pretty much exactly as it sounds. You don't work at the pace you would normally be expected to work at. You go deliberately slower doing the tasks. Therefore, you're just reducing your productivity, considerably. Less output, etc., occurs as a result of that. You're still working. You're not striking. You're just doing it very slow. The next one is called a work to rule, and that's a bit more complicated. But essentially, what it is that you are doing every single thing in your job contract, but nothing more. Now, you've possibly never seen an employment contract, but employment contracts tend to be not quite as specific as they could be. They tend to be a bit vaguer than they could be. The language tends to be quite general. So, for example, with teachers, right, in our employment contracts, right, it's not a big secret, right? One of the lines within the employment contracts, pretty much any school that you go to will have a line that says something about performing duties as required by the principal. Now, that makes sense because the principal could ask you, you know, we need you to help out and do some duties on the field at lunchtime. We need you to help out and do some duties at the bus stop, or, you know, something along those sort of lines. But it's not actually written in the contract as to what those duties are. So under a work to rule, you're going to say, no, sorry. Right? It's not specifically written in the contract to do that particular task, therefore I won't do it. Yeah? And because workplaces are full of activities that you kind of need to do in order to do the job, there will be no way that all of that information can actually be put into your job contract. Yeah? Some of it will be, absolutely. It might be that in your job contract it has an official start and stop time. Right? But if it's an official start and official stop time, then under a work to rule, it could be, I'm only going to turn up exactly at the start time, not before, and I'm going to leave at exactly the finish time, not after. Yeah, so you see how that sort of works. That's a work to rule. If it's in the contract, you follow it, but you follow it precisely, and you don't give any more. All right. Next one is this idea of an overtime ban. That's very similar, okay? And that just simply says we're not going to work any extra hours beyond the required contracted hours. So it's similar in a way, but it's less about the duties and it's more about the actual hours of work. Yeah. And as said, strike action, the most extreme, the nuclear button, boom, and it all happens. And it's a bit of a worry, you know, when that sort of thing happens, because it costs the employer a lot of money. Right? You think about factories that have to shut down for a day, how much productivity and output they lose. So it is quite significant. Now, I've actually been in schools where the teachers have gone on strike. In New Zealand, that is. The teachers' union, another union I've dealt with, was quite powerful again, and it was negotiating higher pay for teachers, which was all good. And they decided they weren't happy with the government with regards to what the government was offering, so they called a strike. And all of the teachers went on strike, except, well, I didn't, okay? Because you could opt, under the strike laws, you could actually opt to be in school and available for your students, which I thought was the thing to do because, you know, that relationship that you have with the students and the learners, and it's not their fault that the teachers are going on strike. Yeah. So me and my boss, my direct boss, were in school to teach our students. Of course, we didn't have any students because the community decided that there wasn't going to be any teachers at school, so there wouldn't be any point in sending the students to school. And even if there was one teacher at school, they couldn't teach them all day. Yeah. So we were at school doing work, but obviously we didn't have any students. So that's how that kind of worked, which really didn't work. Yeah. And I've had, obviously, in the supermarket, we had discussions about strike action. The unions there, I didn't feel that they did their best with the negotiation. Right? I think that to be perfectly honest, I think that they deliberately decided to fail at the negotiating, right? And by doing so, their only option then was the strike, because it was the nuclear button, because it was guaranteed to cause something to happen. I think that, to be honest, that's how it felt, that the union always wanted to go there, which is why I'm always saying that has to be the last resort weapon used. Yeah. So those are unions, right? Now, the idea is that they're there to protect workers, they're there to look after the rights of workers, to make sure that the laws of the country with regards to employment are being followed. They can do all sorts of things as well, right? So say, for example, if a worker had some legal trouble, then they could apply to the union for the union to pay for a lawyer to help the worker with their legal trouble, for example. That could be something that they could do, because then they're looking out for the worker. Now, there are a range of different types of unions. So again, this is a terminology idea, okay? You do have what are called craft unions. Those are skill-based unions, all right? Those are unions where the people within them are very specific to a particular skill set, right? So there might be the plumbers, the carpenters, they might have their own union, right? Because they know their job and they know what's required of it, so therefore they are best able to figure out what their union should be and do. Industrial unions, they tend to be all of the workers within a particular industry. So the one I mentioned was the retail workers and distribution union, or the grocery retail workers distribution union. That one, it's an industrial union. A general union just accepts anybody from any particular industry, right? And they then help with the negotiating, obviously, and the legalness of contracts. Because remember, an employment contract is a legal document. Once you sign it, right? So it's a really good idea to understand what's in it before you sign it. Okay? One of the weirdnesses of teaching, I'll tell you this one. I say weirdnesses. One of the things that's perhaps a bit different with teaching than other occupations is that sometimes teachers can sign on to jobs just by shaking somebody's hand, and that's not always the case in every industry. Yeah, so if you're a teacher, like an international teacher, and you go to what's called a job fair, they don't necessarily have the employment contracts already written, but at a number of the job fairs, it's told that if you verbally agree to a job, that's it, it's legal, it's done. And there are legal consequences if you then back out of that particular job. So it's possibly a bit different from other jobs that you might be familiar with. So general unions for everybody, and then something called a white collar union. It's a really old expression, this idea of white collar, right? The idea is people who wear, right, shirts and ties were deemed to be the professionals in the industries that they were in. Right, so it used to be all white shirts, so it was a white collar. So if you were wearing a white collar, you were considered a professional, right? I know, yeah, it kind of is a little bit, prejudicial on other types of jobs, right? But in any case, so professional, administrative, right? The CEOs, the managers, the accountants, the lawyers, all of those you would, in the past, at any rate, expect to be wearing shirts and ties to their jobs, white collar. Yeah, that's where that comes from. Okay? As said in the slides, these are all links, so you can look at the slides on the site and you can click on the links and have a look further delve into some of these cases. But some of them you might be familiar with, or you might have heard of. So the first one was an NBA lockout. Now this occurred, NBA, National Basketball Association in America, right? They had multi-million-dollar players, and the owners of the basketball teams, they disagreed, all right? They were wanting changes to their contracts, right? Both sides wanting changes, neither side an agreement as to what would happen. So the NBA player said, look, unless you agree to our terms, then, we don't want to play. We will effectively strike. But before they could strike, the owners actually locked all of the stadiums and locked all of the players out. So it was a really big deal. It was in the middle of a season, effectively. So it stopped the whole season. And they had to have big negotiations about when to come back and what the implication would be and what the new contracts would be and all of those. It was at that sort of stage where people like LeBron James were starting to get on the scene, right? People who were earning multi-million-dollar contracts were there, but the point being was that they were upset because of the rest of the team, right? They weren't, keen on how the rest of the team weren't earning the big dollars, right? They wanted a more equitable distribution of income amongst all of the players. They wanted to see teams that were structured based on They're able to structure their teams based on what they wanted as opposed to what they were basically forced to do based on the cost of the individual players. So they negotiated and they came out with all sorts of different rules that now are in place. So things like endorsement deals, you do need to, in the NBA, you do need to get special permission with regards to all of that. You might have heard of, in Hollywood, a writer and agent dispute. This happened a few years back, so you may not remember it, but if you've gone back and watched television shows from the past, you might have noticed that there were a number of movies and television shows in particular, that stopped. All of a sudden, like maybe in the middle of a season, the TV show stopped. And if they're all, at the same time, then what was happening is that the writers of those TV shows said no, right? They were having a big disagreement with the agents about how much they were being paid and all of their job contracts, etc. And so they just stopped working. They said, no, that's it. We're not writing anymore. And so a lot of TV shows actually stopped at that particular point. There's been a number of strikes in Hong Kong. You'll probably be familiar with those because they were relatively recent, right? Protests about different laws that have been put in place in Hong Kong. And so there are a number of strikes that occurred, like quite a number, and it took and they went through for quite a long time. There have been a number of air travel or pilots and their unions disputing about pay and contracts with governments. And so there have been a number of air travel disputes, because you think about it, I mean, obviously nobody's flying at the moment, but a lot of people will want to fly home over Christmas time or fly home perhaps over Chinese New Year. And therefore that's the maximum time or biggest impact that pilots, etc., can have if they say, look, we just won't fly. Unless you meet our demands, we're not going to fly. So there are a number of cases of that, and I've included one in there. So these are famous examples where basically that nuclear button has been pushed, negotiations have broken down, and they've had to then work their way back to a working environment again, which is quite difficult to do.
Mr. David?
Yes?
Isn't this because, like, so basically in, like, huge businesses, they have, like, HR centers to make sure, like, their workers are feeling good and everything is okay. Is that why it was invented, like the HR or human resources was invented?
Yeah, you could make that. Yeah, that's probably a very good understanding of that. Yeah. Now, the role of HR, human resources, has changed quite a lot over time. And HR is typically employed by the business, so it is looking after the business as not necessarily the employees. But yes, they kind of straddle that idea, okay? Because their first call has to be the law, the employment law, and the business, and what's in the best interest of the business. Then it's about the employees and the like. But yes, you can get degrees in HR, human resources now, and obviously you couldn't in the past. It is much more of a desire to look after the employees. Yes, absolutely. You're right. And their contracts and their pay and all of those sorts of things. But they're probably the ones who will be dealing with the unions quite a bit, depending on the business. But you can imagine, I mean, I've got some examples here just to illustrate this point, but unions haven't been powerful all along. Some are very powerful, absolutely, no doubt about it. And then some unions have declined in power over time. Right? So if you take, for example, there's in America, you'd think about the port workers union, right? The people who work on the port, they're very powerful, and they always have been. Right? You can look at, it's a little bit of a murky history with that, but you can look at that. And other unions that are very powerful are the unions that control the actors in the movies and the people who work in those creative fields alongside the actors, not just the actors, the prop manufacturers, the producers, the directors, all of those sorts of people. There are very strong creative unions within that field, and obviously that Writer strike in particular was one that hit Hollywood quite hard back in the day. But they are still a very powerful union. You can see that. Whether you are allowed to take certain jobs based on the union. So they are still quite powerful, but other unions have actually declined in power. Right? They've reduced, they've lost their ability to negotiate somehow over time. In New Zealand, the government in the early 2000s, I'm thinking now, possibly early 2000s, right? Yeah. For a good number of years, probably over a decade, the government in New Zealand passed laws to actually reduce the power of unions. Yeah? How do government companies negotiate pay cuts? With difficulty. Okay. Yeah, I can give you a real life story about that. Where in the supermarket, I was in the management, and one of the things that we had to do was to reduce our wage bill. Right? Now, there are a whole different array of ways to do that, and obviously firing people is one, so you can then have a reduced wage bill. We didn't really want to do that, but what we did was we did a breakdown of why our wage bill was as high as it was, and it was because of the overtime costs. So we negotiated with the owners of the supermarket chain, and they came up with this idea that they would only pay the base rate of pay and not pay overtime. And by doing so, that would effectively cut everybody's pay and save a huge, like millions of New Zealand dollars. That's literally, that's how much it's saved. But how would people agree to that? Because effectively they are, in that case, negotiating their own pay cut. Well, why would you agree to that? Well, the way we got the workers to agree to it was we said to them that they had to sign a new job contract. Okay, and the new job contract had this particular pay, all right, without the overtime. And we said you either kept your current contract or you signed the new contract. And if you signed the new contract, you had basically a signing bonus. We gave you extra money. And that extra money was based around how much your overtime would have been, but only for a year. So we knew it was going to cost us a lot for 1 year, but after that year and each subsequent year, our wage bill was dramatically reduced. It was like down less than half what it was. Right? We were paying half of our wage bill was overtime. Okay? How it worked was, it's a bit technical, but in the supermarket you were paid a normal rate, which is called time, and then you were paid time and a half if you worked over a certain time period. Right? So that meant you, instead of getting, say, $6 an hour, you'd get $9 an hour. Right? You might get paid double time if you worked over a certain time on a particular day, right? And so that then, instead of earning $6 an hour, you'd be earning $12 an hour. And then you might get paid triple time or even quadruple time, depending on the combination of times that you worked. And so for us, that was brilliant because we just chose the times, right? So people didn't want to work the weekends, people didn't want to work the holidays. So those were the times that had the double times in them. And later in the evenings, people didn't want to work late in the evening because they wanted to be at home with their families. So we would take those shifts as well. And so there were some times where it was a public holiday and it was late at night. And so I personally would have been earning like 4 times my pay just by taking that. So when we were able to cut all of that overtime out, it reduced the wage costs tremendously. But typically, it is based around your contract, your job contract. So if your job contracts renew, they don't stay the same. So each time you have a new contract, after a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long it is, you'll have a new job contract. So the company then will negotiate with you the terms and conditions of that contract. And it might be that they give you a pay rise. Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah. But it might be that they don't. They don't give you the pay rise. All right. So it might be that they instead negotiate a pay cut. And yeah, a personal, history from me, but yes, in the supermarket I did negotiate, because we had to negotiate a new contract for me. I was moving into a different role within the management, and because I was ridiculously expensive, it was going to blow the budget of that division within the supermarket if I was to stay on the same pay. So they negotiated with me that I would have a reduced pay in that division, and then when I moved out of the division, my pay would then go back up again. Right? But it was for the team, and so at the time I thought, yeah, that's great. It did take me 3 years to get back to the same pay I was on. Okay, so yeah, probably not the best negotiating on my behalf, but hey, I was young. That's what you do sometimes. But yes, companies can negotiate pay cuts. But where I was this idea here that unions aren't always as strong as they were in the past. And one of the reasons why is because governments have passed laws to reduce, their strength. One of the biggest laws that reduces the strength of unions is the idea of membership. Right? When I first started being a teacher, and I know that's a long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, right? But when I first started being a teacher, it was by law, you had to be a member of the union. If you weren't, then you couldn't get a job there. So at one point in New Zealand's history, the government said, no, we're going to get rid of that law. Right? So you don't have to be a member of the union to be a teacher. And as soon as they did that, all of a sudden people said, I don't want to be a member of the union anymore. Right? Because one of the things I haven't mentioned is when you are a member of the union, you actually have to pay the union to represent you. Okay? So you're paying fees every pay to the union to do the things that the union is supposed to be doing. And again, if you're not earning a lot of money and you see that you're paying these people and they're not necessarily doing anything, you think, well, why bother? Yeah. And because teaching is one of those careers where it's different to separate out union from non-union, particularly with employment and job contracts. So the New Zealand government said whether you're a member of the union or not, you should still have the same pay. So people said, well, why am I paying for the union then? Right? And they just left the union. So the teachers' union in New Zealand is a very good example where the union just shrank and shrank and shrank in size and ability to influence. Right? So that's a really good example there. And there are other unions as well. And they're either growing stronger because they're increasing their membership, or they're declining because people are choosing, they don't want to pay membership fees. Maybe the government doesn't, they don't have to belong to the membership in order to be in that particular career. Right? So those are two big reasons as to what's happened to unions. There are a couple of wee video clips in the slides that you can watch that explains in more detail as to what's happened to unions over the time.
How much is like an estimation of like the fees? Is it like
honestly, it depends on the union. It really does. One of the funniest union stories, I think it's funny, you possibly won't, but I do, was the teaching union that we had in New Zealand at one of the schools I was at. It was a union just based around that one school. And they negotiated our pay rise. And it was, they were so proud of this pay rise that they had negotiated with the school. And I think it was like 1.5% pay rise. And I sat with my colleagues and we just looked at each other and we said, the rate of inflation at the time was 3%. So we hadn't gained at all. In fact, we'd actually seen a decline in our wages because the cost of living had risen. So the union hadn't actually negotiated particularly successfully at all. But they were very excited about it. So they really didn't understand what they were doing, right? But they wanted to sell themselves because they got paid for it. But yeah, union fees, again, it depends on the union, but you would pay a percentage, potentially, of your wages would go to the union. I can't remember how much it was in New Zealand. As an international teacher, we don't have unions. That doesn't exist. in this particular setting. But in New Zealand, definitely. And yeah, I always looked at my pay and thought, why am I paying this? You know, what are they doing for me? Right. So I was very happy when the government said you didn't have to belong to the union. It amounted to, you know, it would have been, you know, probably thousands of New Zealand dollars per year. And then you would have broken it down onto a per month and then per weekly basis. And so per weekly basis, it wouldn't look like very much. And then you multiply it by the number of staff and, you know, all of that sort of idea. So yeah, the union was earning quite a bit of money. Now, are there advantages to having a union? Yes, there are, right? A union is able to represent the workers. So if you have an issue with your employer, you can use the union to help. They can work out deals with the employer, right? There can be cooperation that is involved, and obviously, and don't worry about those two, right? Okay. There are advantages to the idea of negotiating, representing workers, and getting the idea of the higher pay and the better conditions. Those are all advantages to having unions. There are disadvantages to having unions. These are these ones. Because of unions, it means the cost of labour rises. Potentially, there's a potential that because the cost of labour has risen, the cost of the goods and services that the labour produces also needs to rise. Potentially. Okay? And as a result of that, if it's a big enough union and it's affecting enough goods and services across the country, then it could actually cause inflation. That, you know, might be a problem. Productivity, if they engage in what's called industrial action or strike action, right? Productivity and lost output and all of the sales, the revenues, etc., that the business could have gained, gone as a result of the strike action. Okay. There can be what's called confrontation, so that argument, right? Because it's the union and they're against the employer, and it's like, yeah. And I had that in the supermarket. That was how it felt all the time. And the union, the representatives, I think it was just the representatives, to be perfectly honest, but they were always sneaky. They came across as trying to talk to the workers without official permission to do so, and, you know, all of those sorts of things. And it was like, you know, just, we will work with you, right? Just don't do that, yeah. But no, that seemed to be the way that they operated. And maybe in the modern economy, maybe unions are less relevant. Yeah? As we move towards more online learning, online working, maybe working independently, maybe you're going to own your own business instead of working in a business. Then what do you need a union for? It's just you. Yeah. We've got a lot more people who are setting themselves up as businesses. A lot more people who are earning income through the internet. Right, the YouTuber people, the influencers, the people who own and operate their own business through online methods. Yeah, so maybe the relevance of unions is gone. Yeah. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages. Now that's in case you get asked. There could be a question. There's the idea of unions occurring in a labour market can have an impact. They can cause unemployment. Okay, they can cause the cost of the product to rise. Maybe we don't want that. The productivity, the output levels, all of that might fall. A little bit more advanced, I apologize, and this is going to be the last thing that we look at today to give you a bit of a break, right? But if we look here at the difference between supplying labour when there's a union to when it's just a free market. So the idea here is that the supply of labour, as you see, is actually less. Because in this setting, what we're saying is that to be in this business, you have to be part of the union, right? So if you have to be part of the union is able to reduce the supply of labour, thereby increasing the wage rate. Okay? So again, it's, do we need unions? Are they beneficial? Yes, they are. Are they as strong as they used to be? No, they're not. So there have been exam questions that have asked you why unions aren't as strong as they were in the past. There have been exam questions where they're asking you to evaluate whether a trade union is good for an economy or not, or to evaluate the effect of a trade union on an economy, right? In which case you'd do that advantages and disadvantages idea, right? Now, I'm not expecting you to be an expert in trade unions, right? But the terminology is very important, okay? What they do, so collective bargaining, strike action, work to rule, etc., all of those ideas, okay? Then an understanding about why they're doing what they're doing, right? About workers' rights, pay and conditions, and then an understanding that the government puts laws in place that can also have an impact on the unions as well, right? Now, please review that. Now, you're going to get a practice question this week, okay? And the practice question is going to be around the ideas of what we've been covering: money, decisions about jobs, savings, income, and then trade unions, right? And that question, when it appears, you'll have some time to work on it, because obviously next week is Chinese New Year, right? Holiday, okay? So you'll be able to work on that over that period of time. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hey kōne rā, have a fantastic day, and we will see you next time, which might be tomorrow. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David.
Thank you, Mr. David.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.